welcome everybody. Today is a really special video dialogue, and we have two really great guests. Shuli Chang, who's an internationally acclaimed new media artist who works across many disciplines, and Dr. Kim Sawchuk, who is a research chair in communications from Concordia University. I'm Dr. Sarah Diamond, and I'm the president and vice chancellor of OCAD University. So today we're going to look at three intersecting concepts: feminism, technology, and difference. And concepts of difference have been central to feminism, whether through an interrogation of language, sexualities, psyches, race. Difference can be seen as binaries with desire and feminization as a goal, or as an opportunity to cross and break boundaries. Today we're going to link the concepts and practices of difference to feminisms, and I pluralize consciously, as well as technologies. The concept of différance was heavily tied up with feminisms in the 1980s and 1990s. Derrida framed difference through language and understanding, and that readings and meanings are not fixed, always contextualized and positioned. And French feminisms, as well as other feminisms, built on top of this notion, and also took up the Lacanian concept of différance as structured through the body and language. For example, Lucy Irigary's terms that looked at différance as an exchange. So she saw women as always the sign that was exchanged, whether in economies or in language, as signifiers. Hélène Cixous uses the term jouissance, and we're going to return to jouissance, to describe a form of women's pleasure or sexual rapture that combines mental, physical, and spiritual aspects of feminine experience, and argues for an écriture féminine, that is, forms of disruption and reappropriation of pleasure through culture. So difference has also played out through cultural difference, sexualities, and looking at difference as articulated through class and race, and myriad other ways of being structured in the world. So it's a great word to unpack, and we wanted to start a little bit about in looking at how to update that term. So we don't want to be only in the 80s and 90s. We want to look at how the term continues to play out, and really update the dialogue today, looking at data, social media, amongst other phenomena and networks, and reflect sort of forward and back. So I'm going to start by asking each of you, maybe Kim, will start with you, in talking a little bit about how you've worked with that notion of différance, both historically and drawn it in a contemporary sense into your work, and then we'll go to Shuli.
Okay, well, I think that my understanding of difference and différance really was inflected strongly through the critiques made by Derrida in his work on, that was really a deconstructive moment where they were taking apart the ways that binarisms were set up in society and culture, that were setting up sort of epistemologies that pitted A versus B, and sort of unpacking how that always meant within a structured binary that one term was going to be disavowed or disfavored. So Gayatri Spivak's feminist work on subaltern subjectivities then picked up on Derrida's work. And again, that kind of subaltern third world post-colonial critique and appropriation of the concept of différance from Derrida, I think made an incredible contribution to feminist thinking. And so I do want to signal Spivak's incredible contribution to feminist thinking. And as well, in my case, I think that what was called U.S. Third World Feminism, named by Sheila Sandoval, an important Latina feminist writer, for me was an article written in the 1990s that was kind of floating on the edges at some level of a lot of the debates that were happening around through French feminist theory that was strongly focused on psychoanalytic issues. And she was really talking about how the contributions of women of color were making us understand the notion of difference, not as something added on to our identities, but as something that's integral to what we have to think about as feminists and women working in the world where we were born into unequal relations of power. We were born into systems and structures that divide. We were born into forms of stratifications. We were born into different kinds of circumstances. So they were questioning the whole idea as well through kind of, in Sandoval's case, picking up on postmodernism and postmodern thought, thinking about how it is that difference in terms of identities that were at that point, she talked about mobility and fluidity and alliance and coalition building as a possibility. So how can we work with each other, not just despite difference, but because of this? So in that sense, my interest in the term difference, although I had read all that psychoanalytic theory, really became, I think for me, its key resonance really came through reading. Somebody asked about a book. This book, I would say, for me, essential reading, Methodology of the Oppressed by Sheila Sandoval.
Yeah, it's a great book. So Shuli, a great transition to talk a little bit about your history and how the word has moved through your life.
Yeah, actually, too, it's interesting to bring up the difference back, kind of rooted back to the whole 80s, 90s theory. And I think as a practicing artist, throughout the 80s and 90s, I was really, I functioned out of New York. And so it's really in that middle of the whole jumbo mumbo, in a way. In my work, I sort of have to kind of use different way of either installation or performative work to realize a lot of these cross intersection or all these different theory, that kind of thing. It was a very turbulent time for me also. So my own work was really trying to bridge also, not only in the center of New York City, but actually try to get through to the outside, the third world theory. And of course, if we bring up the 80s, then then we have the whole multicultural debate. I think at that time I was not sure if we are called women of color, but so there's different sort of passage have gone through. I left New York in 1997, which was a kind of a break for me to kind of want to take a really break after 20 years in New York City, very much embattled in the whole debate in a way. So I took on the nomad existence concept, and I was a nomad for 10 years actually. So that was a bit extreme. Being 10 years without any contract, without any rent lease or any bill, officially bill kind of thing. But that was necessary in a way to kind of, for me, it's a break from the whole rooted debate. And I think if you're in America, you're so much in the middle of debate, and you are, I think we mentioned something about gays or being gays or post-colonialism, then you are positioned in a very different situation. You're positioned already in that oppressed class, and I really need to have a reversal of my class, or my race, or my sexuality. And so it's funny to kind of come back here to talk about difference, and then to say, okay, what was that New York period for me, the 20 years, exactly the same period that you're talking about in terms of the whole theory grounds, So I also want to consider what would be the difference now to talk about difference.
That's really interesting. Well, one of the, I think, important both practitioners and theorists at the time was Gloria Anzaludua, she wrote an incredible book, which is The Bridge Called My Back, Writings by Radical Women of Color. So, there's the citation, and then later she really looked at issues of the frontier and her subjectivity and how she crossed many categories of difference. So she was a Chicana woman, she was a lesbian, she was a person with disabilities, she was someone who was incredibly writerly, culturally expressive. So, she fit into both, structures of power that are validated and modes of difference that were traditionally engaged with or associated with oppression, and she argued incredibly strongly for difference to be a form of boundary building and expression of power and engagement, and asked that racialized women, for example, not be afraid of difference but use it as a bridge. So she was very interested in bridging, and Sheila, it just sort of strikes me that your work and the way that you've really worked to transcend boundaries, to be a boundary writer and rupture, I don't think that's the word, but is very much within that philosophy. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about some of that. I mean, there's Brandon, and then there's the kind of transition to some of the work that you're doing now, which kind of refuses categories in so many ways.
Yeah, that is really a problem, isn't it? Because it became a bit difficult to identify myself, especially not only the subject matter that I'm dealing with or my sexuality that I'm dealing with, that being a kind of all-inclusive, or you can say transcending or all-inclusive. So how do you deal with the kind of labeling that we all need, and that for me has always been such an issue. With Brandon Project, which was a piece actually commissioned by the Guggenheim Museum, back at that time, I think I conceived the project and was scheduled for a kind of 1-year narrative, web narrative. So I always think about Brandon was kind of my closure piece in terms of kind of 90s sort of cyber identity, but then it kind of crossed over to the whole transgender, kind of physical transgender identity. Brandon actually is coming from Brandon Tina Brandon, the story of the young Nebraskan who actually got raped and murdered, when his sexual identity was revealed. And so I kind of took that as a kind of departure point to delve into the whole cyberspace in terms of the race identity. And I think this also goes back to the beginning of the opening up of cyberspace, or the superhighway. That's what they used to call it, I think.
The information
Superhighway.
Information superhighway. And I always remember that people were so excited about, in this information superhighway, we will have the whole total erasure of sex and race. That was the promise that we were given. So, in a certain way, what actually Brandon was a piece trying to almost like debate this premises, to say, no, I think there is a very serious race and sexual kind of junction that we have to get into. And it took a year to going through different interface, different chapter, different collaboration, different institution, to kind of be able to explore or investigate all these issues involved. But in a certain way, it is a closure for the kind of 90s or 80s, 90s identity politics also for me.
Yeah, that's great, and we're gonna come back to then what opens in a moment. But Kim, I thought you might want to talk a little bit about those sorts of notions of engaging with difference from a kind of unification, and how your work kind of plays out around that.
Well, again, Shuli's comments are reminding me that in a way back to the Sandoval, I'm obsessed with her book. This idea of the differential mode of consciousness is really about an awareness of what the practitioner's ability about what needs to be done in a given moment of time, with what conditions and under what conditions. So it's, they talk about the demand for flexibility, grace, movement, and and a willingness to be open to new possibilities and to leave some things behind at particular moments. So in some ways, it's a tactical strategy. It's a tactic as well of thinking about how to engage as someone who makes artwork or works with others in the world, because of the exigencies around us that we don't always control. So, as an academic who, was shocked when she got a job, one of the first things I realized was that, again, I love teaching. I love the kind of affordances that an institution can give, but it also felt to me that we could enclose ourselves. And part of the whole project for me in the 90s was how to open up the dialogues and debates around information, around cyberspace, outside of the walls of academia. So a strong part of my practice has always been to try and think about the relationship of sort of para-institutions that we could build of our own, if we only imagined in a way like Femtech is doing, FemTechNet is trying to do now. So again, to allow for debate so that we're not always striving just for unification and solidarity as a dream, but we're understanding profoundly what it is that might actually be not the same, but not seeing that as a liability, but as a strength. So again, when I acquired my identity as an academic, part of the building of, for example, Studio XX, was to create a parallel space where things that were divided, whether you were an artist, you were an activist, you were a social worker, you were working with communities, you were an academic, we all knew that our lives were being impacted profoundly by information technologies. And so we would drag modems around to community centers and say, this is the World Wide Web, this is going to change things, so you might want to know about it, and engage in a negotiated dialogue. So for me, kind of the question of difference has always been related to those questions of what kinds of actions and movements and engagements at a particular moment in time are necessary, and also how does this transform one's sort of seemingly solid identity as academic, as white feminist working in an institution, as second or third generation Ukrainian woman, as an Anglophone in a province like Quebec. All of these things are all intersecting at any given moment in time. And the thinking about difference allows for that.
So maybe just building on that, the whole notion of boundary objects that Laurie Starr so eloquently developed, and this sort of concept that we bring practices and knowledge from one space to another almost as a gift, and then we find this way of creating new ambiguities and new meanings around those. And Shuli, if we move from your work in the 90s to now, your work seems so engaged with concepts of crossing boundaries, ambiguities, raising those kinds of questions about categories. So can we pick up a bit and talk about what some of those fascinations are for you?
Yeah, actually, I do have to say, after the 90s, I think I sort of put myself in really the boundary border crossing mode, that I really want to test how far I can go, and it was really amazing. In a way, it's about the collapsing of the border. How I feel at the time that all around me, that collapsing, that I had nothing to hold on to, in terms of my groundwork, in terms of when I start crossing border, in a certain way, even crossing identity, and then I have to sort of every time you kind of build from the ground, let's put it that way. So you kind of have almost, holding up different handles of your cyber identity, with all these different handles that actually grant you a password to enter into different community in that way. So it is through the network or the net per se, but I think that the capital net or the small lowercase net, that for me, that interjunction is really what I start building my work with, So by situate myself in a small net, and at the same time, I think back to the whole big system issues, be able to really look outside your little pond or little connection, and able to check out the whole infrastructure. And I think I also talk about how I kind of sort of was kind of at the tail end of cyberfeminism also, so it's kind of riding on that, kind of come back down to earth in a way, because when you are doing border crossing, you're really, it's really a kind of custom dealing with the UN, the custom, the immigration issues, so all that become putting yourself on the testing ground, and the big question comes down: who owns the data? Who owns the data? I think in the social network situation, which we are clear about how the data got transmitted and got owned by the big corporation in a way, that including the Facebook and different these social media, which is it's interesting how people is not more aware of it a lot of times. So we are kind of voluntarily keep input, uploading the data. So that is one issue. The second issue I'm concerned with is in terms of our own sort of body data. You go to the hospital, you have a checkup. I think in America, these hospital data actually became the hospital property. So you actually would have to have different process to get back that data. At the same time, when we are talking about, the surveillance of data, it's like a big issues, right? But I think it's about also the control of the data flow. Who can we actually take back these data? And for me, it has been, it resulted in my recent work called Composting the Net, actually taking the mailing list data to compose them in a certain way, is try to retrieve all the mailing list data and have a kind of look through and picking up, what means what, that kind of thing. So I think if we are talking about feminists particularly, and it's also come back to the whole Wikipedia debate, that we do have to look at the data as sort of our most treasured stuff, right?
Yeah, it's an incredible material, and there's some interesting dialogue. Sheila Carpendale, for example, who's a very smart computer scientist and a feminist, has talked about our personal data profiles and how we need to actually not only have activism but also policy that works side by side with activism to really frame that, and that we need to actually build and create the sense of our persona and our privacies and our control around that data. And I know, Kim, that's, as a sociologist, that's, and a communications theorist, that's got to be a big preoccupation of yours as well.
Yeah, well, I actually worked in a marketing research office when I was trying to put myself through graduate school, and I learned everything about data collection and prediction and data mining and tracking from the inside as the star coder. But it also made me understand that things that look like hard numbers also have lineages in the languages, but also where, predictability kind of can also fall apart. So it gave me a reverence in certain ways for certain kinds of big data gathering early on. It made me cry a lot because I could see how, we could not compete with companies who could spend millions of dollars on data collection and develop methodologies that were incredibly complex for trying to predict, in that sense, consumer behavior. But at the same time, the fallibility of data was sort of revealed because there were levels of interpretation in the translation of things like, from a survey to a number. And it went through a whole set of coding procedures, and I became fascinated with the methodologies and the coding procedures, understanding and tracking also how data is actually made. So something that looks like a number actually, and looks like it's hard, and looks like it's completely empirical, is also in some ways a critical fiction, but a performative one that has incredible power.
Yeah.
So
it's a mediation.
Yeah.
It's always a mediation of actual events or processes. So how do you see a strategy emerging?
I'm not sure, but I think that, again, we've had these discussions about understanding how data works, but also thinking about how, things like data mining and tracking are operating at all times, and also the ways that, again, the paradox of open source software is, in a sense, is that you're giving people access to free software, to all kinds of social networking and media possibilities. But again, that same open source software also means that data can be scraped, collected, correlated, and that tracking of people's, for example, every Twitter feeds, so that you know what's happening in an election post hoc, can happen if you set up a system very, very quickly. So I think it's about individuals, and I think what also, Deleuze and Foucault will talk about, it's not just about discipline, it's also about the control of data. That is something we have to think about as individuals now, who are seen as part of, collections of data.
So moving into another technology space that we all three share as well, mobile technologies and systems have been fundamentally transformative of the last 20 years. And there's many contradictions there. They've enabled women in the emerging world, for example, to have, micropayments. They've been so fundamental for massive resistance movements, you know, from the Philippines on to the Arab Spring, and yet they also have incredible capacity for data collection and management and a kind of invasiveness of personal space. So I'd love to hear how both of you, you know, think about the mobile space and some of your interventions there. And I know, Shuli, that you're an application developer as well as someone who's used mobile technology consistently in her work.
Interestingly, I actually thought that the way how we are treating with your smartphone, Android phone now, is like it really replaced the whole debate of the whole cyber processes debate of, you know, the 90s. So here you are being connected to this network object, which is, you know, the mobile phone doesn't exist if it's not at work, isn't it? So that physical boundary is very different from a kind of body attachment, you know. So this is like a kind of mediated space almost for me. It's a mediated object, a mediated space of the mobile technology. I have myself worked with a lot of these. I was, you know, early on, I think in the early 2000, 2001, 2002, I was very involved with the whole free Wi-Fi movement, kind of free network, thinking like, you know, I have a project called Garlic Equal Rich Air, which actually compare eating garlic that share the smell, and Wi-Fi should also be shared like garlic smell. So that's how extreme it could be. So in a way, that kind of mobile crowds or the kind of, you know, common space up on the sky that we share, that I really truly believe in it, that we have that common grounds there. At the same time, I'm seeing how we attach to these particular apparatus. It become your second extension, which is very different. You know, for me, it's not really a bodily function, but it's almost a corporate imposition on your body in a way, because you know, first you have to sign up which subscription, which contract you want your mobile phone to be. So for me, that territory is totally, in a way, colonized. You know, so we are really, our dependency on that mobile apparatus is actually a very dependent behavior, which I'm trying to refuse a bit. But at the time, I remember how difficult there was you know, even within Sundance, the New Frontier section, they have the idea to bring all the mobile phone providers, Motorola, Nokia, all this. You know, that time I think Apple was not even in the scene yet. The iPhone was not even in the scene. So we have all this like different convention going on, and finally I got like sponsorship from Nokia. You know, I was given the first 3G mobile, and I created a project called Mobi Opera, but actually I was more like thinking about soap opera, like how I feel like I'm being sponsored by Nokia from like a soap opera of the daytime TV being sponsored by, what's the soap company called? Huh?
Ivory.
It's not Ivory.
Procter & Gamble, P&G.
Yes, exactly, Procter & Gamble. So I called it like Mobi Opera rather than soap opera in that sense, right? So anyway, I think at that time I was really thinking about a kind of possible kind of collective scenario, collective narrative can happen with the mobile phone, you know. So it was a very optimistic time, very promising time, you know. But at the same time, I think 6 years later, I feel, wow, all this technology has come true, you know. People are uploading, people are taping, filming, people are, you know, whatever, reverse back and forth, like receiving end and uploading end. At the same time, not so happy. So I don't know how to deal with the kind of my own sort of dilemma in a way, or my own hesitance or certain kind of resistance in there.
Kim, over to you on this one, because we were part of the Mobile Digital Commons Network. It's been a big area of investigation for you. And the demographics, too.
Yeah, for a number of years. I mean, again, just listening to Julie's recountings, I share the hesitancy, but at the same time, again, in some ways, occupying that space for a long period of time makes you see how that mobile assemblage in some ways has transformed, the way access to the internet is expected instantaneously, seeing the way that, again, location-based services seem to be, at the time we were trying to build them and strapping Bluetooth sensors on and, working with satellites in connection with this and that and building these kind of wacky projects that were prototypes to a large extent of things that are now realized by corporations.
Yes.
But we were doing it as artists and makers and critical people trying to figure out what was being transformed as well. So I think, again, that kind of dual identity position is like, well, maybe one way, and Haraway will talk about this as well, is can inhabiting the belly of the beast, what kind of information can it give you about how this operates at an intimate level, but at the same time it also can create an identity where you start to feel like you're in collusion with forces that you might not be so enamored of. And so having to rethink that constantly is a challenge. In terms of the current mobile climate, it's also interesting. I mean, I have several projects with different communities who in some ways don't have access otherwise to those kinds of technologies, and infrastructures are uneven. So again, quite often it's a territorial split between rural and urban areas, especially in a place where geography matters a lot, like North America and Canada. So, is this them being able to escape the data realm in a way that's fine? Or is this something where access is this kind of dual thing where you might get access to networks, you might get access to information, but it also means you're giving over access of yourself and of your movements to people who have the capacity to be able to do this kind of tracking. And again, we've had discussions about the device as a physical object. In terms of where does it come from? How is it being recycled? How many operating systems are there? How often does an updating have to happen? And do we have these kinds of desires? Because they are like prostheses for us at some points. Once you start to have them, it becomes difficult to live without. And so there are identity transformations that I think are taking place and new kinds of divisions that are being restructured and reconfigured.
In some ways. We talked about how mobile devices and systems and other technologies in our lives are actually changing or creating differentials in terms of time and how we know and experience time. And I thought that was a really interesting conversation about aging and how when one is aging, one's relationship to the future becomes very different, and at a certain point, one's relationship to the past, maybe signified by our interest in 80s and 90s feminism to some extent, also changes.
But I do think that the issue of temporality is incredibly important. And again, how we conceptualize time, try to manage time. I mean, mobile devices at some levels and learning technologies demand time from us. And we also, again, how much time am I spending, in these kind of data verses, I suppose, is a major kind of question. But also I deal with older populations who I think are often seen as being outside of these data spheres or digital spaces. But to be quite frank, if an entire world is shifting, whether or not you individually own a device or not means that you are impacted in ways by its presence in the world you live in. And so we've been having these discussions thinking about, well, what does it mean to not only think about experience perhaps and nostalgically look back at other times, but to think about how our future understandings and our present decisions about how we manage, how we think about data, how we manage the amount of technologies we have around us, how we think about an assemblage of devices in our lives and whether we want to care for them or not. I mean, in some ways, talking to people who are older about why they use or why they don't, if they will and if they won't, is incredibly informative, because they will often know things about the device and they have lived through many promises that technology will make their lives better, that if they only buy this next revolutionary device, that they're going to be rich and their health will be better, and if they do this, so they've lived through many promises. So So in a way, back to data, marketing researchers will often not look at those populations. If you're over 60, you enter what we call the gray zone. There's no differentiation between someone who's 60 and 90, the way those statistics are presently gathered by, say, the wireless industry. But yet we know there's great differences. But there's also very little interest in, and I think this goes back to Shuli's point, the person who is the non-user is seen as a laggard. So it's expressed in temporal terms of non-adoption. They're seen as people who are too slow or hesitant or timid, rather than perhaps as people who have lived many stages of technological promise and are making decisions about where they want to put their time.
But back to speed is it become a kind of constant driven forces in all of us in a way, in a way that we are driven by this desire to have faster speed, to have faster modem, to have faster bandwidth, and even in life, I think we talk about how to handle your multitask in a speedy way. How to get from point A to B in a speedy way, how to route your map, your daily agenda in a speedy way from A, B, C, D. Actually, I do that all the time. Personally, I don't really waste any point to stop by B if I need to go to C.
There was this intervention to try and look at time as cyclical, and I think about Indigenous dialogues as well, which have really been an important contribution to recent theory about thinking about time again as cyclical, as nonlinear, as being defined in part by natural phenomena and our relationship to them,
Multiple
temporalities, and placing that against this sort of linear drive of time. So it's interesting to try and think about how the way that we work with technologies might in some ways reform, and transform that sort of linear drive that makes everything faster.
And again, back to a larger feminist project, I don't think we all need to be moving at the same speed. And I think as a collective and a collaborative project, figuring out also what your own rhythms and pacing are, it's really interesting to sort of really take time seriously and think about rhythm and pacing and temporality seriously. Again, related back to not just technology, but to questions of politics of difference, because different cultures have different senses of time as well. And so adjustments, if you're working collaboratively with others, is not only about appropriate technologies, it's being attentive to things that are about proximity, haptics, relations, temporalities, the kind of beats, the kind of rhythms of communication that's not just spoken language, but about all those kinds of forms and movements that are about the way we hold a device and work with each other.
In a certain way, I think the most interesting thing for me, also, I'm interested in many things, but one of the things is really about the energy or the transformative energy that we are all kind of engaged in a certain way, that how the energy, I think when you talk about reason and pacing, it's about like sort of in sync or out of sync, isn't it? So certain person probably have 3 double espresso, that kind of energy generated. That's one thing. But I like to think about energy as a kind of transformative or like transferable in the sense even between collaboration. I'm not so worried about being in sync in terms of pacing or rhythm, but I'm really interested more about the kind of transmittable energy, so my energy and your energy actually somehow can merge, or that there's different kind of energy, let's put it that way. And I think in a certain way, and then I think in terms of ecological terms, that we are talking about a lot of, kind of converting energies. I think one of this project I'm doing about composting the city, composting the net, is actually composting the city part. I'm actually working with compost to make performance, but actually I do work with worm codes. Speaking of worm, I use the worm, I use the sensors in the compost, but that also relate to a whole big movement about trying to turn compost into energy, right? So I think in a certain way, I think that's probably the most exciting thing for me to look at the difference again today is that there's so many different ways to look at those existing norm, you know. So like I'm not looking at energy as that it have to be generated by, you know, electricity, you know, like our electricity bill. Rather, I think of energy as a very different resources that we can tap into, and that possibility really opened up for me with my work in tackling different things, with my collaboration with different people, with different generations. And in that way that I'm finding that different energy that can be actually going through generation to generation, you know, horizontally or vertically.
What other sorts of connections, crosshatches, have emerged in your work?
For example, the way I did the Lacquer Baby project, it actually coming from the Lacquer Baby actually came from the whole story with there was a novel by Murakami in Japan, and it's about post-war Japan, when the women who may have a lot of Japanese women under the American occupation, who may have the illegal baby with the soldiers. So all this illegal baby, they kind of just discarded it inside the lockers in the subway station. And so that created a whole sort of lacquer baby syndrome. And I sort of took that story, but I was thinking about more of a kind of a corporate takeover of our sort of biological genes and the whole colonializer of the woman's body also, so it have to do with genes and all that. So I created this sort of science fiction scenario about how the big industry, the gene industry actually using coin lockers to produce clone babies, and how these clone babies become a kind of new labor force.
Both things like multiple forms of materialities and materializations of things. And I think that this kind of like thinking about not the physical and the virtual as being these separable realms, but how they kind of merge together, fuse, interconnect, sometimes disconnect, is also, I think, something that's incredibly important in terms of thinking about not, I think maybe one of the difference between sort of cyber feminism in the 90s and how we're thinking now about virtual as potential that may not even just be actualized in a kind of particular device or technology, but through different, I don't know, projects like the one she's just described, where there's, you know, an incredibly complicated analysis of new forms of power at the same time that it's connecting sort of past mythologies and stories to kind of present concerns. So I think back to that question of both materialities and temporality and time, I think, again, one of the commonalities, perhaps, and points of convergence, I think, a little bit, is that we're both concerned about, you know, things like the foosball table maybe are the most important interactive device, an appropriate one for this particular project, and it can sit alongside, and does sit alongside in our world, very complicated new microcomputer devices. And that, again, the linear notion of technological displacement and the linear notion of, you know, one device replacing another kind of completely obviates these kinds of you know, assemblages of, you know, things that were considered old but are completely relevant in a current moment. You know, again, people in the disability rights movement have done incredibly important thinking about technologies because quite often they have to live with them to live. So prosthesis is not just a metaphor. And I think these kind of the materialities of their lived existences are things that are incredibly important to be confronted by, but also the ways that we do not see, the way that our systems are organized to give me ableist privilege to be able to move freely through space is also incredibly important. The way that technologies like a bus are set up that individuate you if you're in a wheelchair, so because two people in a wheelchair can't readily sit on a bus together, so that there's a kind of completely different experience of space, the city, time, and yeah, so these things are not just virtual, they're kind of actual material conditions of existence that are important to, I think, I don't know, grapple with, and also I think, can inflect in really important ways our thinking about the issue of technology in general.
Teresa de Lauritis, has talked in her work about the ways that narrative and narrative constructs, in fact, are technologies, that they organize conventions of looking and hence both prohibit but also encourage certain kinds of pleasure. So it's and of course those technologies are aligned with actual apparatus of production, but they actually sit at another level of how we understand culture and experience. So it's interesting, Shuli, in the work that you create. I mean, you have this way of creating multiplicities of stories and possibilities. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, storytelling in that almost analogous way as a kind of technology and how you see telling stories.
Actually, in a lot of my work since 2000 has been in this kind of post-internet crash. I have set myself in a post-internet crash. But recently, I did migrate into a new net. It's a bionet, which is actually set inside human body, and it's using the red blood cells as computing units. And so for me, this is like a kind of final colonialized space. Also, for a lot of my work also involved like eco-corporation. That finally the big corporation, the Ganon corporation, would took over human body as hostage to build a bionet. In a certain way, that's why I'm not so worried about a whole lot of kind of transgender or a lot of women of color issues anymore, because at the end, if the data become a 0-1 issues, right? So then how you gonna color it? That is the question.
It's interesting to think about agency as being viral, and that the sort of subject position that you then take up, again, sort of coming back to thinking about how narrative is constructed is one of the virus, which is able to proliferate. The ability to disrupt and remake and both shut down but also re-engage. So I wonder if, Kim, you want to pick up that?
Well, we've talked about energetics.
And also, actually, it is about multiplies and also mobilized. For me, like virus can be mobilized. And so I call them viral agents. They could be totally could become a sort of resistance force. So yeah.
Yeah, I guess I would say that there's sort of multiple forms of subjectivity within that. So that's what's always of interest to me. And I'm also interested I love the idea of being a viral agent. And I like the idea, again, of feminism being an energy and not an ideology, because there's an openness there. But as well, finally, I think that what's interesting is, bioartists like Tanny Duff, who's a colleague of mine, is really working with viruses intensely. And one of the discussions we quite often have is how interesting it is to think through the virus, because it's not really a live thing. So it's like a zombie in a way. They can't decide whether it's dead or not, or alive or not. So viruses are really interesting because they're not bacteria, they're not organisms either.
So, we started earlier on, we talked about the notion of jouissance, which was so important to certain kinds of feminist thinking. And it also translated in terms of a discourse around reclaiming sexuality and pleasure. And I'm wondering how each of you see the question of pleasure in the work that you do.
In my case, it's motivating. It's in some ways what it is that actually energizes my desire to keep engaging in things that often feel quite futile. So for me, pleasure is not just something that resides in the body. It's the pleasure that comes from the unexpected. It comes from the kind of my bad mathematics. I always think 1 + 1 = 3, and there's pleasure that is greater than of working with others and in concert with others in ways that actually can derail you at times. And so pleasure is a really complicated thing, but it's for me as a feminist, it's absolutely essential because it's a project.
Coming from that trash land, the net crash scenario, my pleasure become a more in terms of sex and gender, in a way, it became a more fluid approach. You know, it's sort of like you just have to get what you can get. You know, in terms of pressure. So in that sense, I think that there is one big reason how the way that I kind of construct a lot of my sexual project or sexual work into a very multi-split gender approach, you know. So in my film work, there was no more gay versus, you know, gay, or whatever, like woman versus woman, but it actually is a very mix up and mess up kind of situation, and I really like that, to be able to sort of swing in this kind of multiple fluid ejaculation.
Really libidinal.
So feminism is messy pleasure. Thank you
Yes.
very much.
Thank you.